The man who would become the outlaw arrived in the valley of Aethelgard with nothing but a rusty axe and a silence that clung to him like a shroud. He gave his name as Kaelen, though the few who asked suspected it was a name borrowed, much like the axe. Aethelgard was a place of hard, practical people, their backs bent from tending stubborn sheep on the hillsides and their faces carved by the wind that swept down from the barren, stone-topped mountains. The great forest that had once given the valley its name, the Whisperwood, was a memory, a tale told by grandparents to wide-eyed children. In its place stood the Griefsbane range, a desolation of rock and scree, where the only thing that grew was despair. The Whisperwood had been felled a generation before by Kaelen's own father, a timber baron named Alaric. It was not a harvest. It was an eradication. The ancient oaks, the hard pine that sang when the wind blew, the silver-barked aspens that held the moonlight like liquid, all had fallen to the relentless teeth of Alaric's saws. The wealth had flowed out of the valley on lumber carts, leaving behind a scarred and bleeding land. The soil, no longer held by a web of roots, washed away with the spring rains. The streams, once clear and cold, ran thick with mud, and the weather turned cruel, the wind now a biting scourge without the forest to temper its rage. Kaelen had been a boy then, but he remembered. He remembered the scent of pine sap and damp earth, the dappled light on the forest floor, the profound, living silence that was not empty but full of presence. He remembered the last great oak, the one the loggers called the King's Tear, and the way it had groaned, a sound like the world breaking, as it fell. He had seen the look in his father's eyes, not triumph, but a hollow, insatiable greed. That look had haunted Kaelen, festering in his soul until the weight of his inheritance, the gold he never wanted, became unbearable. So he came to Aethelgard, the source of his family's sin, to perform a penance no one had asked for. He used his tainted fortune, not to buy comfort, but to purchase the most worthless, eroded, sun-baked slope of the Griefsbane range. The villagers of Stonehollow, the only settlement left in the valley, thought him a fool. The madman on the mountain, they called him, and left him to his folly. His folly was a forest. He began with the axe, not to fell trees, but to break the hard-baked earth. Day after day, under a pitiless sun, he swung the pick, carving out tiny terraces, creating pockets where soil might be persuaded to stay. He built a low hut of stone and sod, and his life became a ritual of back-breaking labor. He ordered saplings from distant nurseries, oak, pine, rowan, beech, paying exorbitant sums for their transport. He planted them in the painstakingly prepared earth, and one by one, the fragile young trees withered and died, baked by the sun or strangled by the thirsty, impoverished soil. A year passed, then two. Kaelen grew lean and weathered, his hands a network of scars and calluses. The villagers, mockery softened into a kind of pitying curiosity. Alara, the widow who kept the village's lone goat herd, sometimes left a wedge of cheese or a loaf of coarse bread near his hut. She was a woman whose own laughter had been stolen by the harshness of life, but she saw in Kaelen a different kind of harshness, one turned inward. "The land is dead, Kaelen," she said to him one evening, her voice as dry as the wind. "You cannot coax life from a stone." Kaelen looked at her, his eyes the color of the gray sky before a storm. "The stone remembers the forest," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. "It is waiting for it to return." He changed his methods. He became a student of the dead land. He observed where the scant rainfall collected, where the morning dew lingered longest. He learned to read the subtle signs of returning life, a patch of hardy moss, a stubborn clutch of wild thyme. He began collecting seeds himself, from the few stunted, ancient bushes that clung to life in the deepest crevices. These were the true children of this land, he reasoned, and they would be its salvation. He stopped trying to impose his will and started to listen. He built intricate channels to guide the rare rainwater to his terraces. He planted hardy, nitrogen-fixing shrubs to begin the slow, invisible work of healing the soil. He mixed the seeds with clay and water, forming them into seed balls that he would hurl into the most inaccessible corners of the range, letting nature decide where they would take root. And slowly, impossibly, it began to work. A pine sapling, grown from a local cone, survived its first winter. Then another. A carpet of low, tough grass began to spread from the base of his terraces, holding the dust at bay. After 5 years, there was a faint green fuzz on the bones of the mountain. After 10, there were patches of shade where none had been for a generation. It was the shade that changed everything. The shade cooled the ground, trapped moisture, and created a new world in miniature. Insects returned, then birds. The wind's howl was muted by the rustle of young leaves. The people of Stonehollow began to notice. They saw the green blush on the mountain from their doorsteps. They felt the air was less biting. The stream that ran through the village, the one they called the Muddy Beck, began to run a little clearer. And that was when the trouble began. The Lord Governor of the province, a man named Theron, visited the valley for the first time. He was a man of progress, of industry. He saw the fledgling forest not as a miracle, but as a nuisance. The Crown had designated the Griefsbane range as Crown land, to be held in reserve for its mineral rights. A forest, in the eyes of the law, was an illegal encroachment. It was squatters' settlement of the worst kind, one made of living, growing things that complicated the neat lines on a surveyor's map. A summons was delivered to Kaelen by a rider in the Lord Governor's livery. He was ordered to cease his unauthorized cultivation and afforestation, and to vacate the land immediately. Kaelen ignored it. He had a pine, now 20 feet tall, that he needed to protect from a blight. The law, to him, was an absurdity spoken by men in distant rooms who had never felt the crumble of good earth between their fingers. The next visit was from the sheriff and 2 bailiffs. They found Kaelen tending a young rowan tree. By order of the Crown, you are trespassing, Kaelen, the sheriff said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet grove. This mess, has to go. This mess is a forest, Kaelen said, not looking up from his work. It is a violation of statute, the sheriff replied. You have 1 week to clear it. If you do not, we will return and burn it. The word, burn, hung in the air, a poison. Kaelen finally looked at the sheriff, and the man took an involuntary step back. The quiet intensity in Kaelen's eyes was not that of a madman, but of a prophet. You will not burn this forest, Kaelen said, his voice low and certain. The week passed. Kaelen did not cut a single sapling. Instead, he walked the growing woods, touching the bark of each tree, a silent farewell, or perhaps a blessing. On the 7th day, he stood at the edge of his forest, his father's rusty axe in his hand. The sheriff returned with a dozen men carrying torches and axes of their own. They stopped at the sight of Kaelen. He was no longer just a recluse, he was a sentinel. This is your last chance, outlaw, the sheriff shouted. Kaelen hefted the axe. The first man who raises a torch or an axe to these trees, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, will feed them with his blood. He was 1 man against a dozen. But he stood on a threshold between a dead world and a living one, and he seemed to draw strength from both. The bailiffs hesitated. They were men of Stonehollow, or from villages like it. They had seen the change the trees had wrought. They had tasted cleaner water, felt a gentler wind. The sheriff's orders felt wrong, a sin against the recovering land. It was Alara who broke the stalemate. She had climbed the path, followed by a handful of other villagers, the blacksmith, the weaver, a few shepherds. They did not carry weapons. They simply stood behind Kaelen, a silent, shabby line of humanity. This forest is ours, too, Sheriff, Alara said, her voice firm. It is our future. You will not burn it. The law had met something it did not understand. The will of a people, and the righteousness of a man healing a wound he did not create. The sheriff and his men retreated, their authority crumbling before the simple, physical fact of the forest and its defenders. But the Lord Governor was not a man to be defied. Kaelen was officially declared an outlaw. A bounty was placed on his head. Any man who captured him or proved his death would be rewarded. His forest was condemned. Kaelen vanished into the woods he had planted. The trees, now tall and thick, became his fortress. The villagers, his network of spies and suppliers. He became a legend, the green ghost of Griefsbane. The bounty hunters who came for him found a hostile land that seemed to protect its own. Trails they knew would disappear. They would be led in circles by misleading animal tracks that the villagers swore were made by Kaelen himself. Some were chased off by rockslides that seemed curiously timed. Others simply got lost, and were found days later, babbling about a man who moved like a shadow between the trees. Years turned into decades. The legend of the outlaw grew, but the man within the forest grew older. His hair turned white, his back stooped, but his eyes never lost their fierce light. He continued his work, planting, tending, nurturing. The forest was no longer a collection of trees. It was a single, vast, interconnected being, and Kaelen was its heart. The Lord Governor Theron died, and his successor had no interest in a petty outlaw in a forgotten valley. The bounty was quietly forgotten. But in Stonehollow, and in the forest now known as Kaelen's Copse, his story was the bedrock of their world. One autumn, Alara, now old and frail, walked the path into the deep woods, where the oldest trees stood like pillars in a cathedral. She found Kaelen sitting with his back against the trunk of a massive pine, the very first one that had survived. The air was cold, but the forest floor was soft with generations of fallen needles. The silence was the one he remembered from his childhood, full and alive. He smiled when he saw her, a rare, quiet thing. "It sounds right again," he whispered. She sat beside him, and they watched the golden light filter through the canopy. He closed his eyes, and his breathing slowed, becoming one with the gentle sigh of the wind in the branches. He was found the next morning by a young shepherd boy, who ran back to the village, breathless with the news. They carried Kaelen's body out of the forest with reverence. They buried him on the mountainside, in a clearing he had loved. They did not mark his grave with a stone, for they knew the whole forest was his monument. The story of the outlaw who planted a forest was passed down. It was told not as a tale of crime and punishment, but as a story of a different kind of law, the law of return, the law of atonement, the law of life insisting on itself. The man who had been an outlaw in the ledgers of the crown was remembered as a king in the chronicles of the land. And in the heart of the Whisperwood Reborn, if you listen closely on a quiet evening, you can still hear the echo of his promise, a whisper of leaves and a future reclaimed. You will not burn this forest.